back to Beating a Dead Horse. As always, I am your host, Sean McKinda.
And at long last, here at the end of Nihon Nigatsu, even though it is no longer Nigatsu, I am your host, Jackson Keller.
And at even longer last, and part of this is because what we watched this week felt like it stretched it on for eternities. It was a truth that we could never fully arrive at. Hey-yo.
You beat me to it by 1 second. But the way you phrased it was way funnier.
We watched JoJo Part 5, which was the only part of the currently animated. I don't know if that's the past tense of animated, like animated, but like animate. I got there. We made it work. It's funny. You laughed. I
think I'm mostly laughing at the dejection and sorrow in your voice.
Well, listen, we are done with JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and I could not be happier, mostly because how much I hated JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 5. And we're going to talk about that a lot in a second here. But if you are joining us on JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 5 to hear about it and learn about JoJo, whether you should watch JoJo, here's what you need to know. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is a long-running anime / manga, still ongoing at this time, following the lineage of the JoJo family, the Joestar clan. In this version, in this iteration, it is the son of villain Dio and the previous, in the body of Part 1's Jonathan Joestar, and it's Italy, and it's a mob boss thing, and they fight each other with stands, which are ghosts that punch each other. That's JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 5, right? I mean, that's the skinny of it.
That was shockingly succinct. I'm proud of you.
Should you watch JoJo's Bizarre Adventure? You should check out the first part. Don't necessarily take my hatred for Part 5 to be a distinct no, because I do like parts of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and I'm going to get to that in a minute here too. Let's talk about JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 5, though, first. I just didn't want to turn anybody off who might be thinking, I was going to watch JoJo, but boy, this podcast doesn't seem to like Part 5.
Yeah, I mean, if you're joining us again, my opinion of Part 5 shouldn't be a surprise, because at the end of Part 4, I gave my, as of that time, rankings of every part, and Part 5 was dead last. And I regret to say that watching the anime fully for the first time, I mean, that alone, I'm a big JoJo fan. I'm like, the only part I haven't read is 8, and I'm waiting for that to end because I like to like have a full story. The fact that I wasn't able to finish the anime before this speaks volumes, I think.
Because you read the manga previously, just to be clear.
Yeah, I did read the manga. So I started reading the manga. Part 4 had just ended. I had gotten caught up on the series because, you know, for the short version, Sean created his own enemy like the Batman, like I keep saying, in that he introduced me to Part 1. Persona 4 is one of my favorite games of all time, and I knew that took a lot of inspiration from the show. I started watching it. Became frustrated and had a wild time and a wild experience. And, you know, I'm sure we'll talk more about that as, you know, Sean talks more about JoJo as a whole, as we sort of look back at this. But ultimately became a big fan, very invested in the JoJo mythos. There are parts of it I love. There are parts of it that I absolutely hate, but there just isn't anything like it. And yeah, Part 5... I started reading it after the anime for Part 4 had finished, and its reputation in the fandom was not kind back in the day. It seems like the anime has made a lot of people rethink that. I don't know how that could be, because watching the anime was so much more painful. No, I mean, like, to say that, like, I hate Part 5 is a little strong. There's some... That's totally fair. There's some cool stuff in here, I think, but not enough for me to say that it's anything but the worst part, and the worst part by a fairly substantial margin at that.
Listen, this is the same argument I made with part 3 way back when. Cool, the few moments of cool stuff does not make up for 35 other episodes of just boring, confusing, uninteresting fights and filled with characters that are more cardboard cutout than Kakyoin, and Kakyoin is paper thin. So
well, we'll talk about Araki's approach to character. We'll talk about that a lot, I suspect.
There's a lot to talk about in this episode, just because it is the last of the JoJo episodes for now.
I just want to say it's actually kind of a bummer that we have to end here, because part 6 is actually one of my favorites. And I don't know if Shad would think the same way. It's very divisive in the fandom. But then again, I mean, so was part 5. So maybe, people just, I don't know, maybe people just like whatever is anime instead of boring old reading, I guess.
Who likes reading?
But no, part 6 is I think it's my favorite of the stand parts. And I include part 7 in that, which is also great. Like, part 6 is not perfect. It does have some of the same problems that part 5 does, but I think narratively it's much, much richer than any JoJo part before it. I think it's more thematically coherent, even if like the plot and the action goes even crazier than some of the shit that we saw here. It goes fully off the rails, which I think is what a lot of people hate about it. I kind of dig that it goes so weird. It's almost like fucking cosmic, and it kind of fits with the themes. But that's part 6, and I love part 6, and I wish we could end there and have a spirited discussion. Even if Sean hates it, we could have a little back and forth.
It sounds like it'd be interesting, if nothing else. Whereas
part
5 didn't necessarily even really hit that, except for like the third to last episode where it started to get really interesting, and like that's where it does kind of start to get on that cosmic level that you're talking about, which like as you've been describing part 6, I'm like, okay, well, themes and characters, that's what I liked about part 4. Part 5 kind of started to get cosmic towards the end there. This sounds like something that I should theoretically like. The asterisk there, of course, is that it is still JoJo, and I have mixed feelings about JoJo on the whole.
I can see you at least respecting what part 6 is going for, if nothing else. I really enjoy it. And I think the big difference there for me ultimately is that Jolene is, the one of the best JoJo's, and Giorno is the absolute worst.
Giorno is fucking nothing for the show to be named after him. Giorno is a whole thing. Just a quick rundown, because obviously I did not like this part. I do want to add a little bit of positivity to it, much in the same way that Jackson did, just because I think it is unfair to unilaterally decry something that does have some interesting ideas and does have some things that it does okay. And it does have something that it does okay. There are some interesting moments. Some characters are almost interesting. They're kind of dragged down by other things going on around them in a lot of ways. There are some kind of clever ideas and stands. There's some kind of interesting fight stuff going on. It's just, it is, in my opinion, as I've said, all the worst parts of part 3, where it's just monster of the week, but somehow manages to be worse than part 3, because part 3 at least really leaned into that monster of the week and made it kind of fun and comedic in a weird way. And part 5 is like, no, we're doing Goodfellas badly, and you just kind of have to say, all right, Araki, I guess we're doing Goodfellas badly.
Yeah, I guess like to elaborate on this, because like I've been thinking about this a lot with the stand parts, and that like my overall, if you want like my quick bite-sized impression, is that with part 5, I think even more so than 3 and 4, like Araki's trying to develop, he's fumbling around, he's figuring things out. And I think eventually that'll lead him into some good places with part 6 and 7, but it just doesn't come together here. And there's a lot of missed potential, because Goodfellas, but with stands, can be a lot of fun.
That
and
sounds
you can see,
rad as hell is the thing.
Yeah, and ultimately it comes down to this. So with part 3, like sort of my argument in favor of part 3, which I do think is one of the weaker parts, but I still appreciate, is that...
I mean, listen, I like part 1. I think that we're allowed to have parts that we can admit are not great, but there are things about them that we like and elevate them in our eyes.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I feel similarly about part 1 too. Like they're honestly pretty close in my estimation. I go back and forth. But like with part 3, like part of what makes me a little kinder to that one is that like it has the like, you know, the great like globe trotting road trip vibe, and it commits to that. You know, you're constantly seeing new locations, and it fits the monster of the week well, and the characters are, you know, paper thin, but you know, a lot of them are just goofy clowns, and it can be fun to watch them clown around like you're on a trip with the boys, and it commits to that vibe, and it's great sometimes. Other times not so much, but
other times there's a monkey controlling a ship. And
other times there's the monkey, which normally a monkey in a show would be a good thing, but not this monkey.
Part 5 also manages to one-up that, don't you worry, if you're familiar with the monkey.
I can't believe I forgot about that scene, but that's also a testament to how forgettable a lot of the individual stuff in part 5 is.
Yeah, so I mean, content warning, if you are going to go watch part 3 and part 5 in particular, sexual assault. Yeah, it's rough.
Fun stuff. It's not fun stuff.
No, it's miserable. And again, I cannot believe that part 5 did Alien but badly as well. Like just the core of Alien, but like make it a joke. What?
That's kind of all you need to say, really, is that they took Alien and made it a joke. Yeah, so that's miserable. And the fact that it's more miserable than the monkey, I was watching the show with somebody. We had to stop after the monkey. She was like, I can't take another minute of this. And I'm like, that's fair, honestly.
Yeah.
So like, if we're going even worse than that, you know it's yikes. But, you know, that's part 3. Part 3 is like the road trip, and I think that in that regard, it's at least cohesive, if only in intent. Part 4, on the other hand, is a similar. It's similar, but it's different in terms of its vibe. It's kind of comfy, more explicitly so, in that you're just sort of like palling around with the boys around the small town. Like the thing about part 3 and 4 is that although it is disappointing that, for how like tight, relatively speaking, part 1 and 2 were in terms of its story, it can be disappointing to go to like the more monster of the week structure. But at least in part 3 and 4, like once you saw what he was doing, you could appreciate it on its own merits.
And part 4, to be fair, does eventually come into its own, like its own identity,
Yes.
its own story about halfway through, which it makes sense. Like you kind of want to have that small town vibe build up to that point. I clearly
purpose.
like part 4 quite a bit. So
Yeah, that's all good stuff, and that's all part of what makes part 4 so interesting. It like, you know, if occasionally frustrating for me at times, but overall interesting.
frustrating for me. Don't worry, I'm not here to say that part 4 is perfect, but
Araki was playing to his strengths. He was playing to the strengths of the format. A big part of that was Shonen Jump. I think a big reason that like we switched from like the tight like plot progression of the first 2 parts to the Monster of the Week stuff is that like if you know anything about Shonen Jump and like the horrible like labor conditions and like the weekly like burnout that authors have to go to, yeah, this like Monster of the Week stuff is much better on Araki's side of things, like come up with new ideas. So I don't blame him for doing that. But the problem is that instead of having a road trip, instead of being a comfy small town, Araki decided to do Goodfellas. And the thing about doing Goodfellas or Godfather is that those are mob stories are at their core very much about like character relationships and power dynamics and politics and lots of subtle stuff that like in order to do well, you need to be good at writing character. And I think that Araki of today, if he wrote part 5, could pull it off. Araki back then could not and doesn't.
no, part 5 flounders in about every regard, as I keep saying. So I don't want to continue to beat that dead horse.
Oh,
I'm sorry, I did not know how to.
was that the first time we've ever done that? I think it was.
If it wasn't the first, it's one of like 3 times that we've ever done that.
I was gonna say, it's been a long time, if not.
Yeah, we try not to, but it happens sometimes. Regardless, I if you're okay with it, I'd like to move on and just kind of, now that I've seen all the anime that's available out there, I kind of want to just talk about my thoughts in general in the pre-discussion, because I'm not going to spoil anything. I'm just going to kind of give you my vibe as someone who is overall pretty lukewarm on JoJo.
Please, by all means. I mean, the way I figure you can say your piece. I've talked more at length about like the broad meta stuff in JoJo in previous episodes, so I won't bang on about it too much. But if I have a thing or two to add, I will, and then we'll move on to the spoilery details. So,
which is where we're just going to rag on part 5 the entire time. Spoilers
Yes.
for the spoiler discussion. But so my problem right now is, I would say, if you, like me, are just not really that into manga or anime, you might struggle to get into JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. But I am 450 chapters into One Piece currently, so I don't think I have that card to play anymore, unfortunately.
You've played all 3 Danganronpas. You'd already lost that card.
Yeah, I also have read all of Chainsaw Man at this point, so I kind of lost that. But I also can safely say that I generally prefer manga over anime, so I take that as my own little bit to it. I don't necessarily have anything against anime. Parasite is still one of my all-time favorite shows. It's absolutely stellar and does everything incredibly tight and well-paced. But if we're talking like weekly serialized stuff, I think that reading the manga is better, which probably colors why I am so lukewarm on JoJo. I think that if you're going to go watch JoJo, watch the first part. You're going to get a good vibe of what the rest of it's going to be in only 9 episodes. If in those 9-10 episodes you go, this isn't for me, absolutely tap out now. It's only going to get weirder from there. But I think the core thing that I want to get at, beyond just like, should I watch JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, is, would I, Sean McKinda, recommend JoJo's Bizarre Adventure to anyone? And I think, honestly, my answer is no. As wild as that is, like, I have some opinions and takes on JoJo, as I think at this point I have rightfully earned, having watched much JoJo. But in general, it's just such a hard show for me to recommend. I think even going back to part 1, which I recommended to Jackson because I thought it was buck wild and fucking great to watch. I might be where I stop, is I might say, watch part 1, figure out where you're at from there, and move on, or continue to watch, and just gauge yourself as you're watching it. Do not push yourself to watch past what you think that you want to watch. If you hit part 3 and, like me, went, this sucks, turn it off. I would probably have a much better opinion of part 1 and part 2 had I not forced myself to sit through part 3, part 4, and part 5. And to be clear, I love part 4. I genuinely think part 4, the back half in particular, is really strong and really good anime. But I don't know that I can recommend it because there's so much stuff that you have to watch ahead of it to make it make sense.
Yeah, I generally agree, because like a really probably more common than, I watched like a few episodes of JoJo and I couldn't do it. I think more commonly what I've heard is that people who vibed with part 1 and 2, and I haven't made that many people watch it, but like almost every time, like, people have been like to varying degrees into part 1 and 2, and then when they get to part 3, they're like, whoa, I don't want this anymore. And like, there's a lot of reasons for that. Monkey is a big filter.
Monkey is a big filter.
Especially because it's so early on. But like, even just like the structure, like for a lot of purposes, it's weird. It's basically a completely different show by that point.
Yeah, no, entirely. And so like, I guess then comes the next question of like, why do I still have feelings? And like, why do I want to rank JoJo? And like, what would I do to get to a point where I could recommend JoJo. And this is something that I've thought about a lot. Like, what don't I like about JoJo, and what makes me so reticent to be like, yeah, you should watch JoJo. And like, Monkey is a big part of it, but Monkey would also be solved by my answer to this question, which is chop off 90% of it. Part 1 is my favorite part entirely because it is 10 episodes long, and there is some fluff to it, but it is fluff with intolerable levels. There is not 40 episodes of fluff. It is not 60 episodes of fluff that is part 3. It is still an episode and a half, 2 episodes of fluff, but it is tight. You see it, you get past it, you move on to the other good stuff. And if we could shore up part 3, part 4, and part 5 into just a little bit more tighter packages. Like part 2, I can't really necessarily think of much fluff on it. I think it's fairly compact. It's only like 29 or so episodes.
I would argue that part 2 is tight as hell, and that's why it's my favorite.
Part 2 is good. Yeah, absolutely. I like part 4 just because it's a little bit weirder, but I completely respect liking part 2 because it is tight. It does what it wants to do, and then it moves past it. Part 3 flounders, part 4 flounders, part 5 flounders. Which makes it so hard to recommend. And shoring up these parts would cut out the weird sexual assault undertones in certain episodes because Monkey is not important. Alien but a joke is not important, and we can just cut out the guff and make it tight and nice and interesting and fun, and it still would be bizarre and weird and great to watch, and the fights would still be over the top and make no fucking sense in the best possible way. And I entirely, up until part 5, mean that in an entirely endearing sense of people just fucking one-upping each other in the most insane ways humanly possible. But there's just too much of it. There's just too much JoJo, which is why I will never recommend JoJo to almost anyone, because I can't imagine talking to somebody and being like, you know what, you should watch 200 episodes of nothing. You're gonna have a great time.
No, that's the thing, is that like I've been thinking about this a lot too. Like, would I recommend JoJo? I mean, I'd recommend part 2 unquestionably.
And part 1 in doing so, you need that part 1.
Exactly. I think but the part of what makes part 2 so good is the way that like it builds and plays off of part 1. So like, yeah, I mean, I'd recommend those 2. Like, I think that most people could get something out of it, but like after that, I mean, yeah, I mean, it is just a question of like slogging through stuff. And I think the reason that like I'm so attached to JoJo is that like if I knew enough about a person and their taste and like how they engage with media, I might be willing to make specialized recommendations for JoJo, because I think in order to get the most out of JoJo, you have to be an absolute psychopath like I am. That like, you know, I'm basically a JoJo scholar at this point, and that's demented.
So can you explain to me the final enemy of part 5's stand? Like, as a scholar, could you explain that to me? And I'm looking for just a yes or no, so we don't spoil anything.
I can try. To be honest, that's like the one part. This is like the one part of the show where my scholarly research has failed me, I think. But regardless, like I think what's so interesting about JoJo has less to do with like it being a good show, because parts of it are, but. I mean, like, well, I'm serious, because like if someone asked me, is JoJo a good show? I mean, like by most reasonable standards, I would say no.
No, like, it's trash. It is trash TV.
But like at the same time, like there really is nothing quite like it. Like the fact that it shifts styles, it shifts characters, it's very bold and brash in a way that I appreciate. And I think in particular, it's not only bold and brash, but the other thing to keep in mind is that like it was extremely influential in a lot of other anime. Like the way I've heard it put is that it's like it's your favorite manga author's favorite manga, which is a little weird to think about because the production of the anime is modern, and unlike Dragon Ball and like other other like contemporaries in its prime, it didn't get that anime adaptation. Like part 3 got one OVA that like isn't that well known or liked. And I think part 1 got a feature film that like apparently was such a botched adaptation that it's like lost to time now. Like nobody bothered holding on to it.
I was just thinking that I want to watch that. That'd be interesting to see.
I would love to watch it, but like, yeah, I mean, I've heard it's not good. Regardless, though, I mean, like, I think that is like, JoJo's got a sensibility that's uncommon to anime. Like Araki in his like interviews and stuff, he's got a very particular way that he views the world that I appreciate, and like, there's a whole lot to dig into, which I, as like a psychopath, like. But like, as for the show itself, again, like, there's stuff about it that I think is brilliant. Like, Yoshikage Kira, I think, is a brilliant fucking character. And it's the kind of brilliance that only can come from pure, unfiltered madness. But to get to Kira, how much garbage do you have to get through? A lot. So, like, I love JoJo. It's probably one of my favorite shows. It's also terrible.
Yeah, it's hit a point where the fact that I have started to read One Piece as I'm sitting here ragging on how much just guff is in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is an insane juxtaposition in a lot of ways, given that One Piece is literally at 1,005 chapters right now, and I am on 450 something. I'm sorry. But I'm sitting here with the fucking courage to say, no, JoJo is too long. There is too much JoJo. But I think the thing about JoJo is that Jackson's right. Like, so many other things have been influenced by it and have taken the ideas and done them better. If you like the high octane, but what you're going to say next is this of part 2, go watch Death Note instead of part 3. You're gonna love it. It's gonna be great. If you like the fighting, go watch fucking like Naruto or Dragon Ball Z. If you like the nothing can stop me because I have the power of anime and friendship on my side, go read One Piece, because that's what that is. These are all manga or anime in some cases. I'm a manga reader because I'm a snob like that, I guess, that have grown out of JoJo in one way or another and have done it better in a lot of cases just by seeing what works and doing away with a lot of that fluff and a lot of that filler. But, you know, honor to the originals, so to speak. And I think that's why we did, way back when, Quarantine Classics and went through and watched all those. The thing is that watching a classic movie is, at its longest for us, 4 hours with Seven Samurai. JoJo Part 5 was 15? Something like that?
Something like at least 10.
Yeah.
At least 10.
Yeah, it was multiple full days for me. So there is a slight difference in that regard. I guess if you really want to go back and see what it was all about, just read it. You're going to get through it quicker. You're going to get through it with much less growing pains. You're going to miss out on the openings and endings, which up until part 5, really fucking good. I have problems with part 5's openings and endings, but outside of that, look them up on YouTube and you'll be good to go.
Well, here's my recommendation. I am torn on the issue of manga versus anime. I haven't read all of the JoJo manga, but I've read a good chunk of it at this point and like have seen all the anime. So like I'm torn because the anime is a really strong production in terms of like the music and the sound effects and the voices, and like a lot of stuff. Like production gives
good part of part 5. The sound design is stellar. The sound design of part 5 is so fucking good. Oh my god, Moody Blues, I could sit and listen to Moody Blues all day. Not the band, not the album, the stand. The stand makes good noises.
Don't you mean moody jazz? Burgle, burgle, burgle. But the anime is a very strong production. But the manga, I mean, it is easier to swallow. And like, you know, Araki is a very strong artist in terms of his composition and like, you know, a very unique voice in that regard. I think what I'd recommend is this. Watch the anime for part 1 and 2. I think the anime is better than the manga because the early manga for part 1 and 2 is rough. The art is rough. You know, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You know, either stop there. I mean, honestly, like, part 2 is basically the completion of that story arc. Like, you can stop there and be satisfied. But if you must go on, read part 3, part 4. Honestly, part 4 is sort of a weird middle ground, and the production is probably the strongest in that one. So I'd say, like, I don't know.
Part 4 is stylish enough that if you want the visuals for it, I would say, yeah, watch part 4.
It's so weird because, like, basically, I think you should watch part 1 and 2 and probably 4, but read part 3. And then, like, just out of obligation, read part 5. Because it's not even like you need to read part 5 to get what happens in part 6. That's part of what makes it so weird. And if it were good, it'd be weird in a way that I could appreciate, that it's so disconnected from the rest of it. But, like, you know, as it stands, it just feels like a side story waste of time. Because then in part 6, we actually get back to, like, the whole, like, legacy plot of, like, the Joestar family and, like, and actually develop that in a way that feels kind of satisfying.
Interesting.
So I don't know.
I was thinking about that watching part 5 because I know I had qualms with part 4. I'm like, oh, what's the fuck was up with the arrow in part 4? And you're like, don't worry, it gets answered a little bit in part 5, and some of the stuff comes back. So I was always kind of in the back of my mind thinking, like, all right, well, you know, part 5 was weak, but maybe there's some stuff that they're setting up with it. And I think that perhaps there's some stuff in the final few episodes that they set up, maybe?
Yeah, like, I mean, we should probably move into spoilers.
Okay.
I think we're brushing up against it, yeah.
Let's dive into spoilers then. If you're still with us, first of all, I'm so sorry. But if you are enjoying the podcast, please leave us a review on iTunes. Tell your friends about us. It's the only way we grow. You can follow us on Twitter at BADH_cast. Next week, I think we're going to watch Hausu. I think we're technically going to continue on with Japanese month, but we're going to watch something in the Criterion Collection again, and it's going to be a good, weird horror movie that is very, like, proto-Evil Dead, and I'm fucking pumped for it. I've seen it once before, and I'm ready to watch it again.
We got to give Sean his proto-Evil Dead horror, because I just made him watch 40 episodes of the worst fucking JoJo, basically for the purposes of completion.
And listen, here's the thing. You owe me, like, multiple horror episodes. Let's be real here. We're going to start going down some of the list that just, like, you fucking hate, and I'm going to be like, let's do this, let's do this, let's do this. You're going to be miserable. I'm going to have a great time.
I owe you a couple, that's for sure.
A pin Rill. Hellmaiser. Let's go. We'll get through half of them.
We'll discuss that.
All right. Well, for now, though, let's get into spoilers. And I suppose the best place to start with spoilers is probably at the very end, because who gives a fuck about anything else in this goddamn part?
Yeah, I mean, we can talk more broadly about characters, but yeah, let's start at the end, because it is at once the most interesting part of the story.
Agreed.
With the exception of maybe the beginning. I think the first few episodes do a good job of setting stuff up, which is disappointing that, like, it goes nowhere. It's actually very jarring that, like, you hit a certain point, like, after the fight where Koichi exits the story permanently. It's like, okay, we're doing part 3 again, and you're gonna hate every second of it, and you do.
Yeah, it just kind of, like, all of a sudden sweeps over you. Somewhere around, like, episode 7-ish, where you're just like...
I think it is, like, 7 exactly.
Yeah, something shifts, and it's not really entirely clear what it is, but you just suddenly get hit with that, oh, God.
Well, maybe I guess maybe we can start here, because I think this is relevant, because one big revelation I had watching part 5 that was hard to put my finger on before this, because I think it's clearest here, is just how lacking Araki's approach to character is, at least for this part. I think that with part 6, at least with Jolene, like, Jolene is the first character that has a fucking arc in all of JoJo. And then part 7, there's a more rounded cast of like deeper personality. So he does get better at this stuff. But like the revelation I had is actually it was something that you pointed out to me that sort of made me brain blast. Sean, do you want to complain about the characters? Like tell the class what you told me in that one text.
So the problem with all of these characters is that there is a way to introduce your character and have them build a story around their character. Be like, oh, this is Narancia and his deal is this. And let me just cite One Piece. What a fucking surprise on this, where the Straw Hat Pirates will show up at an island. They'll meet a new character. You'll be like, okay, that's probably going to be the new character for that they're just going to join their crew. And sure enough, it is. But like in this arc that they're going through, this like 50 chapter arc, you slowly learn bits and pieces about why this person is struggling against the fight that's happening on the island and what they're about and how they interact with the world and who they are as a person. JoJo Part 5 says, no, in the middle of their first fight where you see their stand, we're just going to cut away and give you a 15-minute backstory on their life before you know who they are or care about why they exist in any way, shape, or form. And also, it doesn't really inform who they are at all.
No, or like it barely does. Like what is
for most of the characters, it explains why they joined the mafia, which, okay, that feels like a starting point. Anything more you want to tell us about them? Their parents are dead? What does that mean for them? Nothing? Okay, never mind. Fight continue.
And that is exactly the problem, is that like Araki, it's really like people like to meme on Kakyoin for being a cardboard cutout, which he is. But the thing about it is that like he did the exact same thing for Kakyoin that he does for these characters. The only difference is that Kakyoin got his sob story at the very end when he died.
Spoilers for part 3, I guess.
I mean, we're talking about.
I was
gonna
say we're talking about part 5. If you skip part 3 to get to part 5, first of all, what are you doing? Like, what is your life?
I mean, someone must really like Goodfellas if they're gonna do that.
No, someone must really not understand Goodfellas.
So, you know, it's basically like in that regard, Araki's approach to character hasn't really evolved at all in these 5 parts. Like, really, like you're completely at the mercy of whether or not the character in front of you is fun. You know, that's been the main thing that, like, you know, there's been a lot of fun, memorable characters, you know, Dio, Kira, Joseph, Josuke, Rohan. Like, you can name a lot of fun characters in JoJo. You know, there's Dio, there's Kira, Joseph, Rohan, Okuyasu, Josuke. Like, I can name a lot of them, but none of them, I lied. Like, there was one other character who gets an arc, and it's Koichi in the last one. So he did progress a little bit in part 4, strictly speaking.
And Koichi's arc, almost like it felt like he was going to be the protagonist of part 4, and like there was stuff happening, and his arc was good and satisfying and took place over multiple episodes, and you slowly learned about him and figured out what he was about, and he grew and changed, and Koichi was interesting, and I was excited to see him again until Araki forgot that he was in this story and just he disappeared. Oops.
Yes. So, like, you know, up until now, we've had characters who have had noticeable shifts in their personalities between parts. Like, Jotaro definitely changes a bit between part 3 and 4, but he doesn't change in part 3 and 4 themselves. So, like, you're basically completely at the mercy of whether or not the characters you're watching are fun or interesting. And with one exception, I don't think that's really true in part 5. I do like Bucciarati. I do like him, but that's about it.
Well, the problem is that the characters aren't fun or interesting until they die. Because he can still write a fairly decent death scene for these characters.
That is true. That is true.
Which is an improvement over part 3, because Kakyoin's death did nothing for me, and he was just as cardboard as Abakio and Narancia in these, but in this, Abakio's death, I was like, hey, that actually like kind of hit me a little bit. And like, yeah, I actually watched this whole part with Sam. Fun fact, she missed only like 4 or 5 episodes, which was incredible. She hated it more than I did, unsurprisingly.
I'm sure she did. Oh my God. Yeah.
But you know, she was kind of like talking about like how Abakio's death was kind of goofy, and I'm like, yeah, it was, but like I don't know, it still successfully landed. And Narancia's death was a shock and interesting, and also like, oh wow, I'm kind of hit by that. What the fuck? Why am I upset about that? I never liked Narancia, really. But for whatever reason, he still knows how to make a death compelling, but just not their personalities outside of that. Again, except for Moody Blues, who makes cool noises.
Oh God. And yeah, like that, I guess that's the biggest thing, is that like when your approach to character is still so shallow and like you don't have a grasp of like the fundamentals of building a compelling character that you can follow, making your genre like a mob story which lives or dies by like being invested in character dynamics. Oof. Mm-hmm. Oof. I mean, let's talk about fucking Giorno, because like Giorno,
what's
like
there to say about Giorno? What's there to say about Giorno?
I mean, like that's, I guess, like, here's the thing about Giorno is that, like, I'll say this, that like nowadays it used to be, you know, back in the old days when like, you know, there hadn't been a Part 5 anime, everyone was basically in agreement that Giorno was terrible and they were correct. But now the fandom is splintered and there's a section of people who are incorrect, so we have to correct that.
Now, to be clear, I was mostly joking. There's a lot you can say about Giorno. There's not a lot that Giorno can say about himself, to be clear.
No. So like, here's the defense I always get from Giorno stans, and on paper I agree with
so
this
on
idea.
Giorno you agree?
You can write Giorno, you can write the defense of Giorno's character on Giorno, and I would agree with it, but it still wouldn't make Giorno a good character. So the thing about Giorno is that, like, you know, sort of if we're doing like the Galaxy Brain meme, like, you know, smallest brain would be like, why don't they do anything with the fact that Giorno is Dio's son? Bigger brain would be, instead of
really quick, fair point on that one.
Oh, we'll come back to that. Don't you worry. Bigger brain would be appreciating that Araki went for the less obvious, more like character and thematic driven approach to Giorno's character. Galaxy brain is coming back and realizing that he still didn't do anything with that because he can't write characters at this point. And that's, so basically, here's the thing about Giorno's character is that, like,
so to be clear, before you get into that though, like the people that most people defend is that mid-tier Galaxy Brain, so to speak. It's interesting that you know, he basically went away from it, which is how I pretty much felt Part 4 was going to go when they introduced Koichi. Like, I was like, oh, JoJo's going to be more of a background character while Koichi grows and changes over the course of Part 4, which is kind of how it works on the first half of it. Part 5 doesn't do that.
No, because like I can see what Araki is going for, and like I think that's the most frustrating thing about Giorno's character is that, like, you know, sort of the accusation is that, like, oh, people just don't like Giorno because he's not wacky like Joseph or Josuke, which, like, yeah, I mean, the fact that he's not a deep character means that he, you know, the fact that he isn't wacky makes him harder to enjoy, for sure. But that's not the core problem. The core problem is that I can see what we're going for, this idea that, like, Giorno inherits some traits from Dio, but because he's got, like, you know, the Jonathan influence and had a different background, and, like, you know, there's all sorts of broad parallels you can make, and, like, you know, he's sort of like how Dio wanted to, like, use his ruthless ambition to, like, you know, become an evil emperor, like Giorno is gonna, like, climb the ranks of the mafia, and, like, that's all great stuff on paper.
Hang on, though. Like, a JoJo climbing the ranks of a mafia to become Don, I could see about every other JoJo with the exception of Jonathan doing that, and that's just because Jonathan is the most wholesome beta boy in the world. That's
That's actually the sub problem number 2, is that, like, the defense that people give for, like, oh, like Giorno has like a good heart like Jonathan, but he's like cunning like Dio. That is every JoJo since Jonathan.
Yeah. I genuinely could see any of them, if the opportunity presented itself for them to rise in the ranks through a mafia, they all 100% would, with the exception of Jonathan. Joseph especially, like early Joseph, fuck yeah, he would.
Yeah. No, I mean, like, I think that, like, as far as that contrast, like, Joseph does a much better job illustrating that contrast than Giorno does. Because Giorno's just mostly, like, you know, it's not that he's stoic. It's not that he's cold. It's not that he's not that expressive.
It's
just
that he
like,
never pulls out a Tommy gun and shoots up a cafe.
that is a big part of it. But no, like, I mean, again, there are, you know, future JoJo's, like, you know, Jonathan 2.0 and Jolene are not as over the top. I mean, well, Jolene's a little more hot-blooded like Joseph is, but, like, you know, future characters aren't as, like, crazy as, like, you know, Joseph. And for comparison, I'm even, like, I'm a Jotaro apologist. I think that, like, there is something about that quiet stoicism about his character that can be fun and is presented a lot better there. But with Giorno, it's just like you take the son of one of the most charismatic characters in the entire series, and he's the least charismatic character in the entire series.
Well, that's his
and,
Dio
like,
blood roiling within him, obviously. Like, it cancels each other out and makes him a stack of rocks that somebody painted a face on. And that's a rock fact.
And I guess, like, you know, we can move away from Giorno, but, like, yeah, my problem isn't that, like, they don't go hard on the lore or that he doesn't have Dio daddy issues. Like, that's a good impulse, honestly. It's just that, like, it's with Giorno, it's the same thing as every other character. Like, every other character gets their sob story. Like, you can pinpoint the moment where, like, Giorno's character is done, where, like, and coincidentally, it's where the show slowly starts to, like, you know, fizzle out in terms of character. It's when Koichi gives his little character assessment. In Araki's eyes, Giorno is done. Like, oh, is he as bad as Dio? Like, you know, we're not going to develop that question. We're not going to see how he interacts with, like, changing circumstances and, like, compare him to his father or, like, whatever, which I think Josuke, and, you know, much in that regard, Josuke was much better comparing him to Joseph, too. We get our assessments. Yes, Giorno has the noble Joestar blood. Everything else is just seeing the character. He doesn't grow, he doesn't change, he doesn't learn anything. And that's the problem with Giorno. Not that he's not funny, that, like, the fact that he's a boring fucking character.
But he does the muda. Did you catch that? Like Dio. It's like Dio, but it's not Dio. And instead it's, you know, a paper airplane that I just kind of tossed at somebody, and that's bad. Giorno, I agree with everything you're saying about Giorno. Like, it is incredibly frustrating that I also didn't necessarily want, like, a fight within, like, you know, there are two wolves inside Giorno. One is a Joestar and one is Dio. But I would like to see, you know, some sort of actual change and growth, or, like, more a genuine ruthlessness from Dio, or any. I would like to see emotion, honestly. And Giorno is the most stoic motherfucker since Josuke, right? Jotaro is the most stoic motherfucker since Jotaro. But Jotaro had personality in his stoicism, even if it was just like, this is a rock that we painted a face on, but it also has a thumbs up next to it.
Well, with Jotaro, I mean, the argument I would make, and I think I'm stealing this from iPatchWolf from his part 3 video, so forgive me if I'm just plagiarizing, I'm digging into the recesses of my mind, is that Jotaro, like, was stoic, but, like, when he made a move, it was pretty memorable. Like, I remember a lot of, like, the big Jotaro moments from part 3, and I think a lot of that is I also just really like Daisuke Ono's performance.
Who could forget Starfingers? I
will never forget Starfinger. Oh, man, the best argument for watching the anime is just to hear Daisuke Ono scream "Starfinger!" then stretch out like fucking Mr. Fantastic. But with Giorno, he gets a few of those moments, like especially early on.
Star finger moments too, honestly, where he gets a power and then, oh, never mind, we forgot about that one.
I was going to say, that's the other problem that we haven't even started talking about, is that Giorno's stand can just do whatever the fuck it wants.
And also nothing at the same time. We'll get to that in a second. Continue your thoughts.
I don't know. Again, it's not like I disagree with this assertion that it would have been lame if we went with the lame, like, which one do you feed? But like, and I think it's even more frustrating because they set up, like, initially, like, having Bucciarati and Giorno play off each other. Like, maybe Bucciarati, like, as Giorno, like, gets more ruthless and Dio like, and you know, Bucciarati is like, you know, the father to his men and like is sort of the influence to like Giorno, that like they you know, bring out the best in each other, and like, you know, Giorno follows in his footsteps. That's a character arc that you can do that the show just doesn't.
I mean, it would be incredibly easy to do just through the idea of like, murder is a big deal. Like, do we kill this person or not? And they felt like there was some kind of lip service to that early on of like, oh, you know, if we're going to kill somebody, it's a big deal. But then that kind of just goes away and we never really address who lives and who dies. Mostly, like, there are some things where like, oh, that person definitely died. But we've also seen JoJo people, you know, get shot in the head multiple times and just shrug it off like it's no big deal. So
oh my god, on the train, that part, like, I literally like gasped because I thought the show was doing something different when Mista just gets like fucking domed like 10 times on the train. I'm like, I don't remember this happening. Like, did they kill Mista? Like, what are they doing? And then I'm like, oh wait, this is JoJo, so like everyone's invincible until they're not.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yeah, so don't worry about anything. They will survive everything. Let's talk about his stand, speaking of surviving everything, shall we?
Let's go. Let's do it.
So I really do think that a big part of Giorno's stand is that Araki wrote this ability where he like knocks other people's souls out of their bodies, and then when he hits them, time gets all wibbity woobity, and like, I don't think he understood it. Because it never comes back again. He does it to Bucciarati like 3 times, and then that's fucking it. And I don't think JoJo, until fighting King Crimson, touches another person, honestly. Oh, no.
He gets the 7-page Muda against the mold guy.
I was gonna say, he hits Green Day, which... Araki hit the nail on the head with some of these band names, huh? Just really fucking, yeah, I mean, this guy makes green mold. He's a Green Day. This is a plane. That one's Aerosmith. You know, what do you want?
To be fair, it probably sounds like cooler and more exotic in Japanese, right? Like, you know, like it's just some weird like English word that's like a band name that, like, you know, that maybe the reader knows and maybe they don't, depending on like Aerosmith, they probably know, but others maybe not. I'm sure it has a different effect. It's like the 11307.
Listen, I get it. You know, different cultures, all that good stuff. We could be even-handed with things, but sometimes I just need to dunk on things, Jackson. We can't always be like, yeah, well, listen, here's the thing. You have to understand the cultural differences and get blah, 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 blah. Can't I just laugh at Mold Man being named Green Day? Can't I do this once? It's not even like I'm laughing at a cultural difference. I'm laughing at Green Day. I've seen them live. I am allowed to laugh at Green Day.
Listen, I just had to be an insufferable nerd for a second, but I'm not here to disagree with you that it isn't very funny. It's just called Green Day.
Oh boy. All right. So Golden Experience has nonsense powers, and from there on, after he has officially given up the weird time dilation thing that like feels like should be a thing that actually exists going on past there, because inheriting some of Dio's time powers would be cool, and it plays into the whole King Crimson's time powers thing. It could be an interesting conversation between the two of like the reigning king of time and the usurping king of time and the battle therein. That almost sounds like it could be an interesting discussion, especially given the nature of Dio's lineage. No, he can make things turn into plants and animals, and they do literally whatever the fuck needs to happen at the time.
I think the worst one, like, even when I was reading the manga, I think where I officially gave up on part 5 was the fucking snake, where like he made the snake to like extract its serum to like keep himself from getting dissolved by Cheese Boy's stand.
You know what? Sam was even like, that was the stupidest fucking thing I've ever seen. And the thing about it is that if he had just turned that brick into a snake to like point out where Cheese Boy was and everything else going on with it, I would have been fine with it. I really would have. But as soon as it's like, but this brick snake also has an anti-venom to prevent me from getting killed by purple haze, you jump the shark there. That's jumping the shark.
I mean, because like, and it's not like, you know, people can accuse us of nitpicking, but like compare that to Josuke. Like, you know, Josuke could do a lot of crazy shit, but like Crazy Diamond's limitations were always pretty clear. Like everything that Crazy Diamond did felt like reasonable with what we had seen. Like Golden Experience could do whatever the fuck it wants.
This is, I mentioned this, I'm gonna call back to Sanjuro now because I promised I would. In our Sanjuro episode, I described Go and how it felt like watching Sanjuro was like watching people play Go, and like you didn't necessarily have a clear picture of the board, and we're kind of learning from people who playing it as it was happening. And I even compared it to JoJo, which does a lot of that in the same way. You have a base understanding of the rules, and you are watching masters work within those rules. The important thing is that you can still clearly feel that there are rules in Go, JoJo, and Sanjuro. Part 5 says, but what if there weren't those rules? And what if you just watched people slowly one-up each other in ways that didn't make sense and still does it, and just completely looks at your rule book made out of Giorno and says, no, we're not going to deal with that right now. He can, I don't know, inject himself with anti-venom made from a brick snake into his heart. How does that work? Don't worry about it.
He can also like replace people's eyes and shit. I hated that when they brought back the healing thing, because that one of the reasons that Josuke's healing power was good was that he couldn't use it on himself. So there was still like tension, right?
Oh, I even forgot about that. Yeah, you're entirely right there. But these guys could just come back from literally anything. So it just turned into like this weird fucking dismember-a-thon, and none of it mattered ever. Ever.
And like, I think that even in terms of like, you know, if you're watching JoJo, just watch weird and cool shit happen. Like, I think that having that limitation of, you know, Crazy Diamond's abilities, like, makes it more badass when, like, Josuke does something crazy and, like, throws himself in front of the bullet to, like, ride the, you know, fixing wave on his coat that'll drag him somewhere. Because, like, there's some, like, consequence to it. Whereas, like, they do, it's like every other fight, they're, like, constantly yeeting themselves in front of deadly blows under the assumption that Giorno can fix them. And after, like, the 10th time, it just gets stale. Like, that's the biggest criticism I have with part 5.
After the 10th time, I feel like once you give up the ghost that people can't really die because we can heal any wounds, Bukurati, the obvious exception, what the fuck does it matter? You did it once, it doesn't matter after that. 10 times is being incredibly lenient.
No, for sure. Incidentally, speaking of stands, I like another reason that like we should have rethought Giorno or like just dispensed with him entirely and just made the story about Bukurati is that I like his stand. I think that like that's the rules around sticky fingers are a lot clearer, and like the stuff that happens with the zippers and the different ways he uses that feel more like Crazy Diamond fair play.
No, entirely. I think my one exception there is like I didn't necessarily fully understand how he was traveling underground.
No, I didn't either. Yeah, I didn't. That was like my least favorite fight because it felt like we already got our like big beatdown moment with the 7-page Muda, and then we have this like postscript with Bukurati at the end.
Yeah, it also felt more Calvin Ball than a lot of fights, which was kind of crazy already, because none of it made sense, and the fucking dig stand didn't make a lot of sense in general. Fucking Oasis, god damn it. And like his whole abilities were all up in the air the entire time, and you never really fully understood what he was all about and anything like that. It was a rough fight all around. But I do agree in general though, Sticky Fingers was rad as hell, and I really enjoyed watching him do things like on the train when he dismembered himself. Like that was fucking great. But then we have to go back to Jorno, who can do whatever the fuck he wants. So.
And then by the end, he can really do whatever the fuck he wants.
You want to talk about the end?
I guess like I'm assuming we're gonna end with the discussion of the ending. It just bears mentioning that Giorno's the worst protagonist. The other big problem is that Diavolo is also the worst villain by a country mile. Like, he's so fucking boring.
Diavolo has nothing going for him, much like Giorno. They are the perfect pair.
Well, it's like I was thinking about it this way. Like it's I sort of had a shower moment. I'm like, why is Diavolo so boring anyway? Araki is usually really good at writing villains. And what I realized was that Diavolo has the same role in the story that Dio does in part 3, which is to be just like an outside force that you don't really see that's supposed to be threatening. The difference is we know and care about Dio in part 3, so like withholding him from us and like trying to figure out the mystery of his stand, like we actually care about that. We don't know anything about Diavolo, and the fact that they try to like one up him, like, oh, Diavolo gave Enya the arrow and like that caused Dio, so really he's the biggest bad of them all, was so fucking lame.
I mean, I think even beyond that though too, like it's very clear that Dio is an ultra powerful being that wants to take over and subjugate the world. We know that. Like, and even if we didn't know that going in, you could feel that Dio had massive giant plans. Diavolo wants to sell drugs, I think, and then all of a sudden he wants to get the arrow for some reason. Like, his motivations are all over the fucking place, in part because he doesn't need motivations for the first 3/4 of the fucking anime, because the motivation is for the party to go get him, but they're trying to frame him like he has some horrifying overarching motivation to just do something.
I think the core problem, in addition to that structural one, the other core problem is that you're right, that Dio is like a Ganondorf emperor, and like, very clearly has big plans. We'll hear more about those in the next part. That's why I like the next part better. But the thing about Diavolo is that like at once, I've always thought, even when I first read the manga, that it's like he tried to staple Dio and Kira together to make a villain, despite the fact that those two characters are incompatible. Because what works about Kira is that he, his whole point is that he's low key and his motivations are very human, sickening, but human. And whereas Dio is like an over the top cartoon character. And like Diavolo, in his stand and his motivation and the way he's presented in the story, he just cribs from two villains that are way, way better than him in every single way.
I mean, honestly, that is the crux of the issue with the entirety of part 5. It is trying to be both grounded through Buccarati while also being a fucking cartoon through Giorno. And so it ends up being absolutely nothing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought about it that way, but yeah, you're completely right. Fuck.
Yeah, I mean, that's the issue. And once Buccarati dies, all of a sudden it's about being a cartoon, which is where the final fight takes place. And it is just an over-the-top JoJo cartoon where things get cosmic and interesting again. And Giorno doesn't come into his own, but is an interesting character just through the fact of he has an interesting stand that does interesting things now. What those things are, I don't fucking have even the slightest goddamn clue, but I like them.
It's a little clearer because the manga has like some in-between pages, some like chapter intro pages where like you can stop and like really read the stand effects. So it's still confusing, but I think a little clearer because like stuff's not just coming at you all at once. And that like Gold Experience Requiem, and just what I'm about to say is evidence that shit's getting weird and cool and cosmic.
But before you dive into Golden Experience Requiem, just in case you are listening to this and don't have any fucking clue what we're talking about, I feel like you could have followed along up to this point. There is an arrow in part 5 that has appeared in part 4. I don't think it appeared in part 3, correct?
No, yeah, that was a part 4 edition.
Part 4, it adds the arrows to the story, which have various effects depending on what arrow they are, as well as what gets pierced. And they grant stands or increase the power of stands. And in this version, if a stand gets stabbed with this arrow or any arrow, again, I am unclear on it because part 5 doesn't necessarily explore that much. I assume later parts do in some capacity. The stand gets supercharged and can act on its own without the will of the person using it. It's also worth noting that King Crimson, the stand, can erase time, and it is, yes, just as confusing as it sounds, because it should sound like that dude from part 4 who can erase space, but it's time instead, which makes it way harder to understand.
And the problem is that, and I actually noticed this in the OPs, that like, the problem is that like once you cut away all the confusing shit about King Crimson, functionally it's the same as the world. Like all the stuff that he does with it is the same as Dio's time stop.
Just with about 7 more steps that don't make any sense.
It literally is like, you know, a pathetic like power creep attempt at like what if we made the world, but it was better, which is like, again, a real disappointing step back from part 4, whereas Kira had a really unique, like still threatening, but, you know, really unique and interesting stand. Even when it did go cuckoo crazy bananas and power up, you know, it still had its own identity. But yeah, no, King Crimson sucks. It's confusing, but like even like you can see this in the OP, and that like, you know, every JoJo OP since the Dio battle has done the thing where it shows off the villain's powers, and like in the Dio one, he like stops time, and like, you know, then he walks past Jotaro and it resumes, and, you know, bites the dust. In that arc, he does the time reverse, and in this one, I mean, when we see it actually play out, what Diavolo does in the intro, functionally, it's the same image as what Dio does in the part 3 intro. So like, why bother?
Yeah, as an aside, before we get back to Golden Experience Requiem, I do just have to say, as I intoned, I think the part 5 opening and endings are all very weak, because, you know, when I close my eyes, I wake up feeling so horny is just not the vibe for JoJo.
I thought the second ending was better.
The second ending was more interesting, for sure,
yeah,
but it still wasn't the vibe that I was necessarily looking for from. And I mean, this is obviously incredibly personal taste over actual objective facts or anything, but yeah, I was not impressed with the ending of part 5 at all. And the openings, while never like egregiously bad or anything, felt far more standard shonen and less interesting than some of the previous parts.
Yeah, I agree. I think the part 5 openings are solid. I don't have like complaints. I think that in terms of visuals, they're solid. Like the songs are decent, but they are much more stock for certain than just about any other part.
My complaint with them is entirely in comparison to every other part. Like if this was just its own thing, I don't know that I'd have any issue with them whatsoever. But like, especially after part 4, which had, in my opinion, some of the strongest openings, this is just absolutely nothing. And I mean, even in going back to part 1 with the weird 3D animation happening and everything else going on with it was fucking stellar. And this is like, nah, it's gonna be a shonen opening, but like kind of mob themed. Ooh.
There's some Michelangelo. There's some David statues. It's Italy, so that's nice.
They're in Italy, you see.
Well, while we're here, while we're talking about Italy, actually, I do want to reiterate one thing, that I keep saying this about Araki, and we've been shitting on part 5 pretty hard, but I do want to say one nice thing about it and JoJo as a whole. I do appreciate how much more worldly Araki is than a lot of other manga authors. I do appreciate that, like, he is interested in, like, you know, having this like international feel, and like it doesn't always, you know, result in something good. In fact, oftentimes it can result in something cringeworthy, like that fucking India scene from part 3.
Oh my
but,
god,
like,
I forgot about that.
Yeah, it doesn't always pan out, but I appreciate that like there is that curiosity about the world, and that you can tell that's something that's near and dear to him because Rohan talks a lot about it in part 4. So,
and you can even feel that in part 1 and 2. Like you have this European ass Jonathan that isn't quite Europe. Like it's definitely Europe adjacent, but not quite Europe. And in that way, it adds a lot of charm. But you know, you can't do that with everything. You could do that to white people, absolutely, but I wouldn't recommend doing that to other people across the world.
It's a little different. I mean, if we could be here all day if we wanted to talk about how JoJo portrays various like nations. I think that'd be an interesting
women, minorities, dogs, animals. People who are slightly different from anyone else, people with weird faces, the disabled. What else does JoJo represent poorly?
I think you hit most of the big one.
Monkeys. Can we talk about the end here so we can wrap this shit up?
We should have expected this would be a long one.
I did. I knew it was going to be. There was no way around it. Part 5
I mean, 40 episodes.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about part 5. And yet, conversely, not a lot to say about part 5 because we can really only talk about the opening few and the ending few episodes because nothing interesting happens in between.
That's the thing that sucks, is that it's not even like I dislike it for interesting reasons. Like, most of what I dislike about it comes back to the fact that, like, it's boring, or the characters are weak, or the writing isn't very deep. Like shit, like, real nuts and bolts shit like that. Like, with the exception of the ending, it doesn't do too much that's too crazy.
No, and all of those things feed into the fact that it is just boring, which is, as we've talked about previously, one of the cardinal sins of any form of media. If you are boring, you are absolutely there's nothing. You're not worth it. You're not worth it. If you're bad, you're at least interesting. If you're good, you're interesting. If you're boring, what the fuck are we gonna say about you? There's just nothing to it. So
let's get into the interesting stuff.
Yes.
Then. Requiem. Then.
Yeah.
Oh, I left like a hanging thread when I was about to explain what Requiem does. And we can, you know, I'll let you take the floor after this. But like, cause the way that like I finally come to understand Requiem throughout my JoJo scholarship is that, like, you know, as sort of the opposite of King Crimson, what Requiem does is eliminate causality, basically, which sounds like sick and cosmic and based. That, like, you know, Diavolo can kill Giorno and Requiem can basically be like, no, you didn't. I am like outside the laws of physics and causality. And that like results in cool stuff. And that like Diavolo gets like, you know, the coolest cosmic horror villain dispensing with since cars got yeeted into fucking space.
Too bad it was fucking Diavolo. Would have been a lot cooler if it was a better villain.
Like, can you imagine if, like, after all that, the pain and sorrow that, like, Dio caused throughout generations, if that were him? Dio got off fucking easy in comparison.
Yeah.
Like,
no, I mean, even Kira, like, reliving his victims' deaths or something like that.
Yeah.
That would be rad as hell. It's such a cool death that is so wasted.
Yeah, I know, because, and again, it's not like, we get much satisfaction on, you know, Giorno's end. It's not like we're fulfilling some legacy. It's not like there's, you know,
despite
I think that
what
one of the
ending would have you think.
Despite what the ending would have you think. It's not like we have some sort of thematic connection between Giorno and Diavolo like we had between Josuke and Kira. Like there's just nothing at stake in that confrontation. So the fact that, like, you know, we get this really cool cosmic shit just like doesn't amount to much. And that's, you know, that's real disappointing.
I mean, I guess to be clear, the thing at stake is Trish. And yes, I did just refer to Trish as a thing because the anime treats her as such. Again, Arky, we can have a conversation about women, and someone probably should at some point. So Jolene's up next, right?
Well, somebody did between part 5 and part 6 because Jolene's one of his best characters.
I was just gonna say, yeah, you keep talking about Jolene, so maybe something changes here. But you know, hey, this was rough, buddy. This was definitely a little rough. So I mean, there is, a stake, but Trish is just not that interesting of stakes. Like the highest.
And Giorno's not even that invested in her.
No, he doesn't give a shit.
Bucciarati's much more invested in her, which is why he should have been the main character.
And like, I don't know. The stakes of part 5 are drugs until they kind of forget about the drugs and make it Trish. But Trish just kind of blends into the background most of the time, and you just kind of forget she's there. Even when she gets Spice Girls as a stand, which it is nothing of a stand either. Like, that feels like that should almost be interesting, but the stands in this are somehow largely pretty boring, and that's also a bummer.
Yeah, like again, I think that like some of the villain ones are better. I like the setup of Green Day. Like, I actually do like that. Feels like it could be a fun video game that like you have Earth Boy swimming beneath you, and there's like a stand that like unless you keep moving up, you're gonna get fucked. That's an interesting setup. I like Sticky Fingers. That's about it. Like,
yeah, there's just not that many interesting stands in part 5. The aesthetic of the White Album is pretty rad. I like the whole ice thing going on, but like that fight goes on for way too long, and the bullet ricocheting is just dumb.
I can't stand that shit, and I think that the Sex Pistols voices are really fucking annoying.
I honestly, the Sex Pistols kind of came around on me. I won't lie. I don't know what changed, but I kind of ended up liking them.
I can see it. They mostly grated on me. I think eventually I got acclimated, but especially in the beginning, I was like, ugh.
I mean, part of that is that I think Sex Pistols 5 gets less whiny as it goes on. Like, he kind of keeps that whine to his voice, but it's far less like, they're bullying me. And more just like, oh no, I'm another commentator on the JoJo side of things, like in every other scene in this goddamn anime.
Sex Pistols 5 is our Speedwagon of this part.
It really, actually, though, like it really is, and I think that's kind of why he endeared me in his own way, just because I'm like, oh, you're a commentator. That's lovely, great, okay, that's fine. I don't know. We should talk about the ending really quick and then wrap up here.
Yeah, I was gonna say I think that's my main thing about, like, I don't know if we have anything else to say, because a lot of the other fight with like Chariot Requiem is basically a big game of keep away, and like I appreciate the attempt to do something different, but like compared to the part 3 and 4 finales, like it got nothing on like the tactical, like, back and forth chess game that those were. So
Yeah, I mean, as an aside, I think the Requiems are really interesting, and I like the idea of it, and it felt like it was finally creating stakes of some sort and doing new and unique things as opposed to the rest of the anime. So I liked it for that, mostly because, as I said, things were happening and things were getting weird and cosmic and plot was unraveling in some form or another. But outside of that, yeah, it was still not super interesting.
Yeah, no, I think especially like, I think the thing, because I had a much more positive reaction when I first read it, kind of closer to yours, just because like, oh shit, like stuff is happening, like, oh wow, this is really cool and interesting. But on the rewatch, like when you're ready for it and you're more like watching it as a fight, you're kind of like, this is completely incoherent.
I mean, it is entire. I actually paused the anime to Google, why does Silver Chariot Requiem go berserk, but Golden Experience Requiem is just totally chill with hanging out with Giorno? And I mean, I found out the answer, which is it's the will of the stand user, I suppose, but it still doesn't make a whole lot of sense, especially knowing that Silver Chariot Requiem tried to go berserk earlier at some point for no explicable reason.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that part. Like I with the earlier Berserk part, I'm like, why, if it's dependent on the situation, if it's like situational, then why would it have done that when Polnareff first tried it? I don't know. But I mean, Araki's got a long history of ass pulls, but this is one of his worst ones, I think.
Both the most interesting and worst ones, honestly.
Yeah, it's weird. It's weird in that way.
Though, again, we keep dancing around it and we keep finding great segues. Speaking of ass pulls, let's talk about the Fate Rock.
We're finally there. Let's do it.
At the end of part 5, as you think everything is wrapping up, we get this like pan over to the restaurant where the original squad is sitting there. Sans Giorno, because Giorno hasn't joined yet, he's still killing Leaky Eye Luca back in the field, and they're talking about what to do. And this old man comes up and is like, "Oh, please, my daughter committed suicide. Help me kill the man who killed her because she didn't actually commit suicide." And hey, all right, are we looking at like some alternate time thing? Is this like a final move from King Crimson to like rewrite time or something like that? Hell yeah, this is interesting. Let's do it. Let's go. And then it slowly turns out that no, it's just a long extended thing to say that, yeah, Narancia, Abacchio, and Bucciarati were always supposed to die, and adds literally nothing to anything.
The whole like discussion of fate, because now that I see how part 6 plays out, where that is a much more important theme that's much more consistently explored. There are some other parts where it pops up here and there, but like it's not especially well developed here. It's in fact, I would also go as far as to say it's pretty incoherent. In that, like, you know, it feels like the point of the rock is that like Bucciarati has a choice. Like he can take the easy way and die, or he can suffer and like become like a lich basically to like do the deed and get rid of Diavolo. So it seems the implication to me is that, like, you know, we see the rock sort of changes shape instead of just Bucciarati, like, oh, everyone's going to suffer and struggle, but like, you know, maybe they'll find some like purpose in their death. And it's like, what was that purpose exactly? You're still a crime boss. Like, I guess you're not Diavolo, which is good, but it's not like Giorno is Jonathan, you know? It's not like he's a pure golden boy. Like, he's still gonna be a fucking gangster. Like, he's still gonna be, like, you know, not morally the greatest person, better than Diavolo. So, like, if your point is, like, oh, like, you know, you can't buck fate, but like you can do, you know, the most that you can in your time on Earth, and suffering towards a goal is like noble, like, could have been a more noble goal. I don't know. Like,
I think that the bigger statement to be made there is fighting fate just results in more deaths. Like, I think that is the bigger implication that it's trying to get at there. Unfortunately, 2 problems with that. Number one, isn't it fate then to fight fate? Like, if you're operating under the guise of fate, isn't everything predetermined? So this was always going to happen. So what the fuck is the point of anything? It's all unraveling as it's supposed to. Predeterminism, nihilism. Fuck yeah, baby, let's go. And part 2, which is perhaps the bigger issue, this comes out of entirely left field. There is no thematic resonance leading up to this. There's a couple of lip service bits in throughout, but like in no way is this like some big reveal of like, oh, that's why they died, because fate was always saying that this was what was going to happen. And you know, that conversation about fate that they had every 3rd episode makes a lot more sense now. And no, instead just like, boy, JoJo, fate, huh? Yep.
Am I right, gamer?
15 episodes goes by and somebody else casually offhand's like, what a fate we're in now, right? That's right, Narancia. Good on ya for knowing the word fate.
I mean, honestly, it's just like I have the same feeling about this that I do with Giorno, and that on paper, I think it's an interesting, weird little idea to like cut back to this like prequel epilogue to like make some sort of thematic statement instead of giving like a really cohesive, like, you know, Giorno running the fucking gang like ending.
There was
like,
a reason I was excited for this. You're entirely right. There is something really cool that can be done here.
But just like with Giorno, it's the same fundamental problem that although like, you know, the instinct is good and on paper the idea is good, Arky's just not a strong enough writer, at least at this point in time, to pull it off. And I don't think he does. And that makes me sad. I hate seeing potential wasted. It's my least favorite thing, I think.
Yeah, no, entirely. Just a small nitpick before we wrap up here that I just kind of want to mention is that the structure of part 5 is also very weird, because unlike previous parts where an episode changes happens at the end or beginning of a fight, part 5 takes that episode ending and basically always puts it in the middle of something happening. Like, this is going to be the hook that'll bring them back for the next one. It's the middle of a fight. And instead, it just makes it so weird to watch and makes everything feel like it's running so much longer. And I mean, this happens throughout the entire fucking anime. Like, that happens in the middle of the last 2 episodes as we're in this flashback. Like, we see half of it in episode 38 and it finishes in episode 39. And that's how everything in this part goes. It's just like, here's half of it. The episode's gonna end. We're gonna pick it up later, which is not on paper. It doesn't sound like the worst thing in the world. It sounds like a good way to hook. But if you're watching it like an episode after the other, it just makes those fights feel so much longer, because you're like, I swear to God, this episode should have ended 10 minutes ago, but it did. You just started a new one. Sorry, pal.
Yeah, I hadn't picked up on that, but you're totally right. And I think that, like, you know, that sort of like hook you in structure, like, there are obviously shows that do that really well. But the thing about those shows is that they tend to be very plot and narrative driven, and like, you know, where you are wondering what's going to happen genuinely next week. But the problem with JoJo is that it is mostly, at this point in the series, a showcase to watch wacky stuff happen. So like, the fact that like part 3 really committed to that episodic bit in part 4 as well, that like you could feel satisfied at the end of an individual adventure and walk away and be ready for the next one, I think is critical to making that kind of show work.
Part 3 actually does do this well, despite the fact that it feels like it should fall into that same trappings, but if it is going to hint at what's happening next, it's going to be like a little stinger at the end of like, this adventure's over, they move on, but who's that in the shadows? And not, will JoJo get shot in the head in between episodes? And you're like, well, I know this is the mid-season, probably not. Roll it anyway.
How many times will it be the 10th bullet in Mista's head that'll finally get him?
Yeah, no, the structure just, there are so many little things about part 5 that add up to just a part that feels long, boring, and hard to watch, full of wasted potential.
Yeah, it's a growing pains part. And I do think that, you know, we will grow into something much more interesting. But as it is now, yeah, it's all interesting stuff on paper, mediocre to bad in execution. I do like Bucciarati, though. Just give me the Bucciarati cut. That's just like his character arc. That's like 10 episodes of him becoming like a lich and betraying the boss. And that's probably a decent anime.
I'd watch that, especially at only 10 episodes. Yeah, I can do that.
I have one more nice thing to say before we wrap up.
Yes, please. Let's end with a nice little cherry on top. Too bad that the sundae is made of poo.
Too bad that, you know, we're sitting here, you know, having some stinky poo. And how appropriate, because the nice thing I have to say has to do with my dear old friend Jean-Pierre Polnareff, master of poo in JoJo. I really like that Polnareff is killed and then gets body swapped with the turtle and decides, you know what, I'm not going to move on to the afterlife. Actually, I'm going to live the rest of my life as a punished ghost inside this turtle so I could be your consigliere, Jordo, from my turtle. I want to see a show about that.
Polnareff's return was honestly a highlight of part 5 in general.
Definitely.
Everything involving him was great. And I don't really even like Polnareff. I don't particularly care for anybody from part 3. Jotaro excluded, honestly, because Jotaro is fine, but everyone else I thought was largely uninteresting and kind of lame.
I will not accept this this character assassination of Joseph Joestar, but you know, I just needed to raise my ire, and you can go on.
Listen, Joseph Joestar is stellar, absolutely wonderful in part 2. In part 3, all he does is yell, and that's why everyone likes him. He just yells a lot, and that is not a character.
It is, but his yells sound really, really funny.
And that's why I will not accept this insane take you are presenting to me.
If we wanted to get into it, I could present a more thorough defense of Joseph's character in part 3, but another time.
You probably already have, honestly. I feel like we probably had this conversation. I've been Sean McKinda, living my own death without end, watching JoJo time and time again. And you can follow me on Twitter at Sean_McKinda.
And I've been Jackson Keller. I will never reach the truth, but maybe you can reach it on my Twitter at Jackson J. Keller, and my Twitch stream at Jackson J. Keller, and my YouTube where I upload creative writing lessons and lectures. Maybe we'll do a lesson on why Joseph Joestar, from his appearance beginning in part 2 to his golden years in part 4, is the single greatest character in all of fiction. I mean, like and comment and subscribe. Let me know if that's something you want to see.
If you enjoy the podcast, please follow us on Twitter at BADH_cast. We do have a Patreon, patreon.com/BADHcast. It is paused with a big asterisk next to that. I apologize again for what happened this month. I forgot to pause it. Y'all got charged. I have refunded everybody already. Again, I apologize. You should have your money. If you need to reach out to me, you can at Sean_McKinda, as I said, or any of the other various places you know how to reach me. Also, thanks to the High Future theme song. It was Suicide, alternate take off the album High Octane, Low Expectations. They're a wonderful band. You should go check them out wherever you can. Buy their music, stream their music, support them on Bandcamp, whatever. They're great. Please support them. Also, thanks to 25yearslaterstate.com. There's a little button in the corner that you can absolutely click on. But while you're on their website, you should check out what they're writing, because there's a lot of really talented people doing a lot of really talented writing. Next week, we're going to be watching a horror movie, and it's going to be weird, and it's going to be Japanese. It's Hausu, or House.
Our house in the middle of Japan. Our house.
Bye.
Don't you go into the ground. Don't you go